I was introduced as having started 35 successful companies. That obviously is in the eye of the beholder. I have started 35 companies and as a co-founder of a bunch of them. And rather, success in our world, as I'll describe to you, is the ability of a company to get up on its feet, get patents, get to a certain place, and if people put value on it, then that'll mean financial success. But for us, success means actually delivering products, delivering potential products to others who then take it forward, et cetera. So I want to be very clear that those are kind of heavy words. And for us in the startup world, successfully launching companies is hard enough, let alone launching successful companies. So that's a lifelong pursuit, as I'm sure many of you know. So I wasn't sure exactly what to talk about. So what I thought I would do is give you a kind of a more practitioner's view of the interface between innovation and value creation. Since I did my PhD around the same time Bob Langer was a new professor at MIT when I first started. For the last 30 years, I've been involved in starting companies, and all of them have been at the interface between biology, technology, and science, chemistry, et cetera. And along the way, I've developed some points of view about this activity that I thought I'd share. It necessarily will seem kind of somewhat abstract. I'm happy to engage and talk about why I think this way, but suffice it to say that I'm not using one example, one instance to extrapolate and tell you what it's like. I'm going to try to see things that I've seen over and over again and see if I can relate those to you. So I titled this kind of science-based innovation and venture creation. Entrepreneurship is a heavy word. I kind of tend to call it venture creation. Kind of as an engineer, you're basically just trying to conceive and launch a venture. And I'll say a little bit, time permitting, about the biotech value chain and how I think it's changing. But before I start, since you've heard from lots of people from academia, and you may have heard from others during the day from the pharmaceutical industry, I want to make sure we go back to kind of one simple question. And I'd ask you to think about, in your own lifetimes, what you consider to be the biggest, most impactful from a value to society standpoint innovation. So I made a list. Maybe I'm missing a few things on there. All of these things pretty much were developed in my lifetime. You might think of others. I'm not going to put you on the spot. I would just ask you, having kind of thought about this for a minute, to reconsider and to realize that the single most economically and societally valuable innovation in our lifetime, most people in this room, is the startup company. If you go back 50 years, I'm 53 years old, it simply was not the case that a mere mortal, let alone from university, let alone at a young age, could have an idea they had absolutely no proof for, no product idea for, no patent for, no credibility in doing, and actually attract resources, attract otherwise experienced, sane people, and over time create what you thought about, which might have been a Microsoft or an Apple. I'm not even including the college dropouts, or a Genentech, or an Amgen, or a Biogen. Every single one of these benefited from one underlying innovation, and that is the startup company. And it's every bit as much an innovation as CRISPR is or as gene therapy is, because it is something, it is a process that simply didn't exist before, that had to get the legal system right, the societal values right. People had to dare kind of start trying to do this and learn in doing it. A lot of these things simply didn't exist. And the difference between 30 years ago, when I started my first company, and today, is that back then it used to happen maybe once a month, and now it's already happened during my talk. And then it happened again now. And that just incredible quantitative growth and qualitative diversification of how and where and who does this, I think is something that largely society is missing. Now, you might say, how could society be missing? I can turn on the TV and see Shark Tank, and I know that there's competitions. But if you think about it, it's still kind of gamey. You know, there's lots of clubs and there's lots of associations, but people still consider this, and again, maybe this is late afternoon, so forgive me for kind of seeing if I could shake you up a bit. But people really do consider this somehow kind of a hobby or something people do who can't hold down a job, or people who have attention deficit, or kind of curious people like Bob Langer that you saw before. In any case, most people who look at this still figure, that's not me. I used to play basketball when I grew up, and I used to look at Michael Jordan and I say, that's not me. Even though I play basketball, I want to look at him and I thought, that's not me. I can't do that. And people look at startups in the same way. And I guess my point 30 years later is your kids will absolutely not look at it the same way, because they never lived at a time where it happened rarely and it happened sporadically. And that's an interesting thing to think about as we think about biology, as we think about technology, and as we think about Kendall Square. Kendall Square is, I would argue, the single biggest beneficiary of this phase change in how this is being done as it applies to science, okay? So there, you heard it here. At least that's what I believe. I'm going to spare you this only to just say that clearly innovation doesn't mainly happen in startups. It happens a lot in large corporations, but it happens in a particular way. It couldn't be more different than the way it happens in startups. Or for that matter, it happens in academia. But that too happens in a very different way. The motivations are different, the concerns are different, decision-making is different. And it's important to understand these differences, because from there, you can kind of figure out where you should look for what type of innovation. In the world that I'll talk to you a little bit about, I'd say I would characterize process, if there is any, as largely informal, kind of chaotic, iterative. There's a lot of iteration in what happens. Usually people who give talks are invited because they did something along the way that succeeded, and they all cannot succumb to the temptation to rationalize how it is that they succeeded, and they tell the story in ways that makes it look understandable, however untrue that might be. And I'm the first to tell you that. It's a big temptation. And I only realized this when they asked me 16 years ago to teach at Sloan, and my first response was, you can't teach this. Then I thought, that's what I had heard before, but why can't you help people learn this? But when you get up in front of students semester after semester, as I did for 10 years, and actually have to tell them not the story of your life or all the things that kind of you did right, but actually tell them all the things you did wrong, because that's where most of the learning is, you realize that you actually can learn this. And you can learn this from thinking about what was kind of momentary, kind of chance, and what was repeatable and learnable, and things that you could kind of, you wish you could have done it differently. So I'm not going to do that today, but the point is, there's a lot of these iterative loops here. Anyway, this doesn't really, of course you all know this, high fatality. I will predict that the rate of failure in startups will diminish in our lifetime over the next 20, 30 years. It is simply not the case that startups have to succeed 1 out of every 1,000 times, 1 out of every 100 times. I think that is simply a remnant of the fact that we're in the initial phases of startups, and it's being done by people who have generally no background in doing it, and so they're learning it by doing it. And 300 years ago, when people operated on patients, they also killed most of them. And today, if they kill one of them, they get sued. Some of that is better science, some of that is better tools. A lot of that is society said, you can't be a hack. You've got to be responsible with what you're doing with other people's money. Entrepreneurs will go through the same transition, is my prediction. And schools are where this will start, because we have to get students not to think this is some kind of a lottery and a get-rich-quick scheme, but actually a pretty responsible thing to do in society. That is, you're taking unsuspecting people's money, you're getting people to leave their jobs to join your idea, and if you are not responsible as to how you're thinking about doing these things, you should tell them up front. You should tell them, actually, this is just a game. We came up with it in our dorm, and you shouldn't really do this. Anyway, I'm partly joking, but I really mean what I'm saying, because I just find it troubling that there's so much kind of almost lightheartedness associated with this, when it's actually, when people talked about renewable energy, I don't think the world thought that Shell or Exxon is going to come up with renewable energy. I don't think they thought about coming up with electric cars from large companies. They assumed startups are going to figure this out. So imagine society counting so much on startups for solutions to their future societal challenges, literally outsourcing it to a bunch of hacks, which is what I am. Now, I'm a 30-year experienced hack, so I'm a little better, but I really mean this. Those of you in the room who are entrepreneurs, I hope it doesn't feel insulting, because I'm sure most of you who've done this more than a few years actually might resonate with it, that you don't consider this to be a game, you consider this to be your profession. So with that in mind, so sorry for coming all out in the beginning, but I figured as long as I have a voice, I'll get most of it out first. I prepared a bunch of slides that I'll probably never use again. And my colleague, Miguel, who's in the room, knows exactly when I prepared it, which is why I was late. But hopefully, over the duration of this single slide that I'll build, some of the stuff I'll say is relevant or interesting to you. I'm not sure all of it will be, but hopefully some of it will be to some of you. So the first thing I want to say, and they're not necessarily related, they're just kind of different observation. The first thing I'll say is, over so many years, Kendall Square gets compared to Silicon Valley. And of course, Silicon Valley is the world-renowned, acclaimed, acknowledged center of the universe for startups. Those of us who've been working here have long looked at it, wondering why that is, and wondering kind of why, or what about Silicon Valley, or what kind of things happen there that don't happen elsewhere. And over the 30 years, I can tell you that initially, Silicon Valley was competing with kind of 128 in the computer industry that was heavily dominated in Boston. We all know that kind of went west. But then in the last few years, there's been a curious migration of a particular type of startup, as to use Eric's words, that have colonized basically Boston and Cambridge. And that is life science startups. And if you do the analysis, I think many people have tried, there is no question that the rate and number and output of these startups in the Cambridge area far exceed anywhere else in the world. And you might say, well, why is that? And I'm going to try to offer one possible explanation for it. And again, this is my belief, not anybody else's probably. And that is that I think increasingly we need to think about tech entrepreneurs and tech companies very differently than science-based entrepreneurs and science-based companies. In fact, these things have little to do with each other. Every time I hear a story about a Facebook or an Apple or whatever, I keep trying to figure out something I relate to. And I relate to the fact that it's scary, and I relate to the fact that it's exhilarating, but it pretty much stops there. The kind of people that go into these companies, the role of patents, the cycle time by which these companies think about new products, in the case of tech, every month, every 3 months, every 6 months. In the case of life science, you have a 10-year plan for 3 products. The involvement of regulation. I can tell you a whole bunch of things. The culture of these companies simply isn't the same thing. So I would say that over time, my hypothesis for you would be that these ecosystems have completely diverged. And that when you think about what it takes to actually kind of have the culture and the supporting community for what a life science startup does, you'll find it in spades here. And I'm not advertising for Kendall Square. I don't much care. We have, just so you know, Flagship has 40 companies within walking distance from here. So we employ 3,000 people in these companies. They have 44 clinical trials going on. We're not looking to bring more people in. In fact, the more people leave, the happier I'd be. But I'm telling you what I have observed, which is that it is not the case that Silicon Valley and Kendall Square are comparable. I think they are basically home for different kinds of companies. Now, there are tons of IT companies here. Don't get me wrong, they're doing great, they're thriving, there's big incubators, and I'm not saying these things can't exist. It's not like kind of a binary division. But I think as you think about Kendall Square, it's better to think about what makes it a particularly symbiotic place with science-based innovation companies. I'll extend that to science for energy, science for water, science for agriculture, but I wouldn't for apps, and I wouldn't for a lot of the hardware tech type of companies. Again, they're great, but that's just an observation. Again, by the way, I'd be happy to discuss this with you. This is my only, I don't write a blog, so this is like you're my blog. I'm trying out ideas. The other thing is, over the years, I've heard Phil, I've heard Susan Hockfield talk about convergence, and once in a while I kind of think about what is it that's kind of convergent about Cambridge? And other than the fact that these two words start with the letter C, I kind of challenged myself to think of a whole bunch of things that start with C that actually matter, that actually do affect what's happening here. First of all, I think there is certainly the capability it takes to do the kind of interdisciplinary science that these companies require. This is a field of lots of specialization with integration. And if you don't have the capabilities and you got to constantly look outside for this capability, it may be hard to stand up a completely new, innovative company, but the good news is the capability exists. Second, it exists in abundance. That simply wasn't the case 5 years ago. It exists at such a scale now that if you wanted people who do X-ray crystallography or people who do high-throughput screening or computational work or animal trials or microbiomes galore, anything you want, there are tens or hundreds of people, not one or two. That's very different than a lot of any other ecosystem in this area, in the life sciences. Third is connections. Obviously, with scale comes a degree of connectedness, not only within the companies, but with academia. That is incredibly empowering, because much more than the professors who start companies, the interaction between these companies and a university like MIT, or if you go further, Harvard and others, is of immense value to these companies, because these companies actually, most of the time, aren't sure what they're doing is going to work. And the next best thing is to have kind of a shrink, an academic scientist or two or three on an advisory board, kind of trying to help you figure out how to make it work or how to think about the problem. If you don't have that, you're going to try to take as small a risk as you can. You will not try to go out to the edge of what's possible. You'll retreat to things that are likely going to work, and then nobody's that interested in funding it. So that's another interesting thing that comes from connection, and for that matter, community, because I think once you get enough connectedness, you do have a sense of community. And that community gathers people around like this. I mean, on any given night, you could go to probably 10 different places and hear various types of engaging discussions, from the precise science all the way to, job looking, there's probably 500 chief medical officer jobs that are being looked for around here these days. I mean, it's not one or two or three. So the community is actually becoming kind of much more interested in how do you get these connections to go to another level. Co-opetition, there's a lot of cooperation, but there's a lot of competition in this area. There's competition for talent, there's huge competition for space, and that's a good thing. Because people, in an environment where you're the biggest fish in the pond, it's not going to put a lot of pressure on you to try your best. And I think in this environment, it's kind of really hard to be the best biotech company or the best, most successful clinical trial pipeline. You've got to compete against hundreds and hundreds of people. And in my view, that's a good thing, let alone big pharma as it comes to hiring people. Very tough environment. I think that's a good thing for this environment. If you take that competition away, you don't have an ecosystem. Capital, I think that just the degree of capital that has come here, whether that's the cause or the result, I don't know, probably a little of both, is also fueling all this. But then I'd add one other thing, which also when it comes to thinking about West Coast, East Coast, I think has always been a curious difference, is confidence. Over the years, every time I interact with colleagues in the West Coast, people always observe that companies in Boston tended to be somewhat more, I'll come up with words, grounded, reasonable, established, as opposed to kind of crazy, change the world. And people here, I think, generally felt like that was kind of outlandish, and if you're going to do that, go to the West, go West, young man, or whatever. I think that the confidence required to conceive, create, launch, and develop these companies exists in Boston now in spades, exists beyond the critical mass. And I think in this kind of a business, you could say, will that confidence be shaken? Is it possible that one or two failures later, everybody goes back to what they were doing? I don't know. But I sense in the last 3, 4, 5 years a degree of confidence in doing these kinds of things that just didn't exist. So that's one set of thoughts. A couple of other things, and you can tell me how long you want me to go, but I have a few more slides, so you can pull me off. Another thing that's probably worth touching on, not all of these I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, is in all these years of being involved in different kinds of innovation kind of journeys, if you will. Every one of these companies is really a journey. You think you're going to do one thing, you end up doing many other things. But I've kind of come to think, and I'd propose that you consider this as well, as the best kind of mindset or the best analogy to innovation, the way we practice it at the cutting edge of any field, as basically being an act of evolution. So if you think about evolution as variation, selection, and iteration, as it relates to human beings doing the variation and a collective doing the selection and then iterating to try to survive in that environment, I think that is a better framework for how to innovate at the extreme, how to do disruptive or whatever people call it, lots of words, than any I've seen, and this is kind of what we practice. So my firm, Flagship, is involved in lots of internal innovations and lots of internal venture creation, and we basically do this for a living. We don't find any shame in the fact that we absolutely do not believe that disruptive innovations are made. We think it emerges. And our job is to create the conditions within which they emerge. And it turns out it takes a village in that regard. One of the things that you will laugh at if you haven't heard me say this first or others, but think about it, is that the biggest, the most abundant resource that gets unused in the other way of doing innovation, which is you assert the truth and then you go try to prove the truth and then you design something and you make something, and that's innovation. But this type of emergent innovation has one huge advantage, and that is, you might say, where do you get the selective pressure, right? So over the years, I've come to observe that the second most abundant renewable resource on the planet, let's agree that the free, renewable, most abundant resource probably is sun, right? Would you agree? That's the number one most abundant renewable resource on the planet, free. The second, I think, is people's propensity to tell you how stupid your idea is. Absolutely free, right? Go to any professor here, ask them to give you a new idea. They'll either ask you for shares or some consulting fee, or they'll tell you, why would I give you my best idea? Go to them with a really bad idea, and absolutely instantaneously they'll tell you why it's a bad idea. Right? That's the scientific community, is all about critiquing each other's ideas. But if you as an entrepreneur realize that the sum total of all those critiques, plus what you do about them, rather than getting depressed or feel humiliated or feel insulted, if you just thank them for that critique, turns out 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 of these later, depending on if you can iterate to overcome these, you find yourself in a place where the 21st person you're talking to is up against the previous 20 who have actually critiqued various reasonable things, some unreasonable things that they've pointed out. So this type of emergent innovation benefits from environments that are academia rich and critical thought rich. So that's something to think about. Necessarily, if you think emergent innovation is emergent, you have to anticipate and embrace failure. I mean, this is not a statement of bravery. When you realize failure, you should realize it's the ancestor of a success. There's no way in an evolutionary system that you're not going to go through lots of failed cycles before you get something that emerges as a dominant genome, if you will. And even that won't last very long. So your relationship with failure is different if you resign yourself to thinking with this way. And your relationship with failure is a very antagonistic one in the way we're all brought up, which is there's right, there's wrong. If you got it wrong, then you failed. And it's just, we all know this not to be the case experientially, but this at least gives a framework for that. And then I think, at least what I remind myself as many times as I can, is that disappointment's overrated. I mean, we often go through great lengths to avoid disappointment. Not just failure, but disappointment, the feeling that you might even get failing. And what's remarkable is how many things we avoid doing as a result. Let's just think about it, right? So if you really loathe disappointment, then you're going to make choices all day long such that by the end of the day, you don't get disappointed. But what's the opportunity cost of that? Well, in this world, a lot, very high. So just think about it. I'm sure you guys all have your own versions of the same observations, but this is mine. I'll say one other quick thing, just as a reminder of all this. You know, a lot of times people observe that immigrants, do lots of startups and entrepreneurs. There's lots of books written about immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I wasn't born here. But what I've come to believe is that the immigrant mindset is what you need to be thinking about, not actually physically immigrating. And let me explain what I mean. How many of you are, by the way, not born here? Wow, there's the immigrant mindset. So let me see if those of you who aren't or those of you who are would agree with this. What is an immigrant? An immigrant basically either voluntarily or forcibly leaves their comfort zone, the status quo, what they're used to, and then ends up in a place that is the opposite of that. So they are immediately in a new place when they first immigrate, unfamiliar, they're uncomfortable by definition, right? They certainly don't feel entitled. Huge advantage, right? Because if you are from here, you feel like the society owes you stuff. Immigrants don't feel like society owes you much, right? I mean, just most of the case, you kind of figure out if I could just make do. And I would say all of those things and many more make them poised. That is kind of alert and trying to figure out some way of making it in that new environment. Well, if you take all of those things mentally and apply it to what you're doing in an innovative culture, I would just say that all you do when you innovate is to immigrate intellectually. You leave behind all the things that you believed, and you get yourself to an unfamiliar place that people make fun of you in the beginning, just like when you immigrate to a new country. If you're young, go to a school, watch what they do to kids. Right? I immigrated when I was 13 years old. But guess what? If you get used to that, you have a sense that I got to make this happen on my own. Well, innovation and startups is just one big intellectual immigration, I would argue. And the mindset, the best description of that mindset that I could come up with, which is a pretty tortured state, I admit, is that of a paranoid optimist. I mean, I would say generally, immigrants tend to be optimistic, otherwise they wouldn't muster up enough energy to make it in the new environment they're in. By definition, they have to believe that they're going to make it there, otherwise they'd go back or they'd get depressed probably. But just being optimistic isn't enough. You also have to be very skeptical of everything. Because just like an immigrant, they don't think anything's entitled to them, they don't really know the language, they don't really know the laws, they figure something can come and take all this away from me. That, I call this paranoid, maybe you have a more gentle word for it. That paranoid state, juxtaposed with optimism, is a pretty good mindset in a startup, right? Because if you're not optimistic, you will not take the irrational steps that startups take for a living. If you're not paranoid, you'll take too many of them, and you won't be around very long. So it's this tension between the two that I would say you could think about. A couple other things and then I'm done. Another thing you should think about is, I used the word earlier, is this notion of being unreasonable. I would assert that if you're working on something that isn't unreasonable, it's not worth doing. I'm talking now about innovation. I'm not talking about how you go home or how you sing. I mean, you can do lots of things in a reasonable way, but if you're thinking about doing something that's unprecedented, that is changing some aspect of kind of life or work, then the notion that you set your sights on being reasonable is probably undershooting. Well, the problem though is that if you don't have the resources to do it, which most of us don't, then you start convincing yourself that in order to get people to give you resources, you have to make it sound reasonable. And that's the kiss of death. Because the reasonable version of something that really should be left unreasonable is completely uninteresting to people who have resources. Because they could do that themselves. They don't need you to come tell them a reasonable thing to do with their resources, right? So just think about it. A lot of time we spend trying to take something and make it look, package it differently so it looks like it's probably going to work. Well, not so sure that's the best thing to do. What I think instead you can do is to observe that most things that have changed anything in our lives started out being, think about what Eric talked about, right? I mean, I can show you lots of things. We've done a lot. The leading company in the space that he talked about is a company that we started several years ago that has advanced clinical trials that are actually drugs that the FDA regulates. When we first said we can take a subset of the microbes, not the entire stool, but a subset, and get those in a pill to do the same thing, if not better, people say it's completely unreasonable. Where's the proof? And instead of saying, actually, you're right, it's too unreasonable, let's do it the old way, we just said, we don't have the proof, but let's agree on a set of reasonable steps, incrementally, that if we can do all of this, takes us to an unreasonable place. Does that make sense? So you could imagine, by thinking backwards from things that already work today, you could imagine how a set of reasonable steps could take you to an unreasonable outcome. But each one of them seemed reasonable, right? So that's, I don't know if this makes any sense, but think of yourself, instead of avoiding finding yourself saying unreasonable things, think of yourselves with one foot clearly in an unreasonable proposition, one foot in a reasonable proposition, which is likely today. So your credentials, your credibility, your network, it's all today. There's nothing unreasonable about those. But the further you can stretch yourself out, and then ask the question, can I chart a course incrementally to take us from reasonable to unreasonable? In fact, one way to think about it is today's unreasonable, if it's worth doing, is going to be tomorrow's reasonable. And the people who make it so are, in fact, entrepreneurs and innovators and academics and large company R&D heads, etc. This is kind of what, so just as a way to think about it. Okay. Let me skip that. I could tell you lots of things, but I won't. One other thing, what part of what I do nowadays, is in addition with a large group of people starting companies, is to think about it from an investment standpoint. And one thing I've observed as an entrepreneur, so in the beginning I raised money from 9 different venture capital firms in my first company. It was a different time, 1987, 1989, 1990. These were times where it took 9 firms to invest $11 million into a company. Because every venture firm was $10 million, $20 million. Today it's billions of dollars. But having watched that over time, the one thing I've kind of come to conclude is that if you want to make money in this business, you should think about creating return on innovation. Because if you create return on innovation, then the investment you make to enable that innovation to create that return will be rewarded. But the converse is not true. That very often, if you try to make money on just money, return on investment, there may never be an innovation that sticks, there may never be products, it almost doesn't matter. So I think over time that people in this field, people who are investing in really early ideas, have to ask themselves, am I trying to create a return on the innovation where capital is just an input? Or am I trying to create money on the investment where the innovation is just an input? Well, that's a pretty big difference from the entrepreneur standpoint. Because the entrepreneur is not bringing money, they're bringing an innovation. And I would say that it's important to distinguish the two. Just about every decision you make turns out to be different if you think your job is creating returns on investment. So just think about it. I'll skip these. Maybe the last thing I'll say is innovation supply chain. So the thing that is interesting that I think is changing as a result of this kind of critical mass of startup companies in biotech, especially in Boston, and the presence of large pharma companies, is the interconnectedness between them. And I think what's happening is 10 years ago, pharma used to talk about external innovation and collaboration or open source innovation and all these fancy words that I'm sure consulting companies made a lot of money making up. I hope nobody in this room. But at the end of the day, I think we've reached such a point that I think it's time we think about how large companies source their innovation, not as kind of going to like a Middle Eastern souk, a bazaar, and negotiating over how much the tomatoes cost or how much does this little wallet cost, which is the way it happens today, by the way. If there's a lot of Hep C assets, the value of Hep C assets go down. Every pharma company has a book of demand. I want a Hep C, I want an IDO program, I want the checkpoint inhibitor, and they go out shopping. Imagine pharmaceutical companies with hundreds of billions of cash actually go shopping for their innovation. It makes sense if you do 99% internal and 1% external. But if you do 50, 60, 80% external innovation, I think you got to start thinking about it differently. Much the same way that manufacturers started thinking about their suppliers very differently in the automobile industry or other industries 70, 80 years ago. They started saying, wait a minute, I need what they make in order to be vibrant. I can't worry that when I need them, I can't afford it. I can't worry that the brake pad supplier all of a sudden gouges me on prices or doesn't supply as many as I need. So I have to kind of have a relationship with them so that I can anticipate what they're going to be innovating, or I can anticipate what the prices might be, and we can kind of share a little a priori so that we can make this thing continue to work, not just optimize for that day, for that transaction. That's beginning to happen. You're seeing pharmaceutical companies innovate, interestingly, in the way they do partnerships. One of our companies a couple of years ago announced a deal that people thought was crazy, but they basically did a deal with a pharma company which involved 40 individual different options for 40 different drugs. Now, over the following 10 years, and the drugs were not even specified. But they took 40 options because they figured if the platform can create even 10 of them, I want to occupy the platform so that I have enough of their production capacity that if I just get a few of them, I can fill my pipeline. And then they're thinking of doing it with others. That's not a mindset that biotech companies had before. Before, biotech companies said, I should only be so lucky to get a drug into the clinic and a big company buys me. That's changing, which is, in my view, a good thing because we have to think in terms of making this all sustainable. Let me stop here. I had some examples of companies, but it's getting late. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. All right, does anybody have a pressing question before we start our networking reception?
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really good. I just had a question, or more than a question. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on these two ways of innovating. So one is where you have a technology, and then you innovate the technology, and you find problems or areas where you can use that innovation. Right. And the other method is to actually go identify a problem, and then find a way or innovate a technology that can be used to solve that problem. So do you think one is better than the other, or what are your thoughts on these two ways of innovating technologies?
It's a good question. I actually think those are two ways. I actually think there's even a third way, which you often find yourself in a startup, which is that the need you thought was real isn't really real. The technology you thought would work isn't really real. But you basically start iterating. That's what I meant by evolving. So that you co-evolve the solution and the problem so that you look for a match. Instead of trying to say, my technology is my technology, now who wants my mousetrap? Or I have this rare disease and I got to find a cure for it. You say, okay, let's, just in a scientific way, you come up with a hypothesis, this science for this need. And then you realize it doesn't really fit. You start iterating. You change the technology for that need, you change the need for the new technology. And as you evolve, you start looking for where value kind of rears its head, even though it's not real yet. And then you use that potential to go get money to see if that could be real. That's yet a third way. Is there a better way? To be honest, in an academic setting, the first is the most abundant because there's a lot of discoveries and inventions and technology advances looking for applications. So the course I've been teaching in the last 6 years, co-teaching with Fiona Murray, called iTeams here, does exactly that. Takes laboratory advancements here and then gets students to figure out how to embody them into some value proposition for some imaginary customer and then eventually make it an innovation. The opposite is done largely in large companies, or sometimes consulting firms will identify a new emerging need and then people start looking for solutions. I think startups have the advantage of being able to do it, kind of burn the candle on both ends, if you will.
Thank you.
Sure. Good, 6 o'clock.
Oh.
Big Ben is ringing, or do we still have any other question? Please.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for the excellent talk. You mentioned the most biggest change is the venture-based innovation as a vehicle to drive the innovation. So what's your thought about the difference between all those big pharma innovation center versus venture-backed small biotech in the frontier area of innovation? What's the role they play, and what exactly those the big pharma innovation center do that can help or embrace venture-backed biotech innovation? I don't know if I phrased the question properly, but
no, I understand. I understand your question. And by the way, venture-backed companies is not what I call these things. You might have heard it earlier in the day, but I couldn't care less who backs them. They are basically startups. So just to be clear, I'm not making a difference between what version the startup has. I think startups are their own thing, whether they're backed by venture or other ways. But we're talking about the same thing. Look, I think that to take a drug from an idea all the way to a patient is a fairly lengthy and very expensive thing and very risky thing. By definition, not because startups are risky, but because we don't really understand enough about physiology to identify targets and engage them cleanly enough and know along the way it's happening. So I think that's a long process. And I think that what's going to happen, I mentioned this innovation supply chains, I think what's going to happen is that over time, startup companies who have the ability to innovate over and over again are going to realize that they don't have to take every single one of their innovations all the way to an approved drug, and that larger companies might be a much better vehicle to do that. And they have to share in the economics, and they have to be treated as kind of partners and not kind of, you know, an outsourced R&D place. I think as the relationships mature, there will be a mutualism and everybody will do what they're good at. Some pharmaceutical companies will continue to make disruptive innovations in-house because they will have the ability to retain a really entrepreneurial scientist and they won't kill their spirit long enough to make sure that they do their thing. But many of them will find that you don't need to go all the way. Look, the example that I would give you may sound crazy, but just for the hell of it, is the movie industry, right? Movies used to be made by large studios until the 50s, 40s, 50s. Now, movie studios don't employ actors and stuntmen and garment makers. They have lots of fragmented specialists, and a movie, just like a drug, ends up being an economic entity that gathers the pieces it needs. Now, a big studio might have the money and the distribution to dominate the economics or to be the ultimate producer, but it doesn't mean that just if you want
system. So my own opinion here is that we are going to have biotech being the enablers for big pharma in areas such as microbiome, gene therapy, epigenetics. I mean, areas that actually big pharma cannot build the expertise, you know, from the ground. And also that in order for us to be able to buy into those type of technologies, we're going to need a proof of concept, meaning there's going to be a responsibility in the biotech to bring those concepts, to bring that technology or that particular therapeutic approach into proof of concept for pharma to jump in. And we can set up the expertise internally, or we can work with CROs in building it up and bringing it to patients. But I guess my question is, right now in biotech, at least when I used to work in biotech, we used to bring, you bring the compounds to first in human, and at that point, you'll have big pharma jumping in. Right now, you really need proof of concept. So for biotech, you need to have real drug developers. So talking about the mindset of having entrepreneurs starting up a company, it has to be people that have that mindset, but also that knows about drug development, because you need to bring those technologies really further than you used to in order for the big guys that have the legs to bring it to the patients, jump in and say, okay, we're going to get it, and run with it from now on. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, again, we're talking about what does a supply chain look like. I would say that in the last few years, pharma companies who have waited for proof of concept on the hottest areas have been left out, completely left out. CAR-T has been an interesting area where people basically jumped in after realizing that if they don't actually jump in, people aren't going to wait for. See, the thing is, if you're a pharma company and you're competing for these things, you could say all you want, I want the proof of concept before I move in. But if the next person doesn't do that, then you're not going to get the asset. So I think this is where I actually foresee a lot more upside sharing arrangements that are not outright licenses, that are not outright acquisitions, but are ways in which you can actually coexist, let the startups do what they do, have some option that if things actually play out, you have already enabled it as a pharma company, and therefore you have some special access to it. Because if you really, pharma industry 4 or 5 years ago was telling the venture industry, you guys have to fund this much further before we'll do deals. And so actually what happened is that the venture industry did fund it a lot further, and then the public markets opened, and most of those companies were able to access money, so they didn't actually do pharma deals until much later. Good for the companies, because they got a lot more return out of it, but it's not a long-term relationship. So I would say, my view is that depending on the area, depending on whether somebody has a need and how innovative they are in the kind of deals they do, there will be earlier and earlier access sought by pharma, because I think if they wait very long time, they're probably going to get the 5th, 6th, 7th asset in an area. Now, I know that a company like Pfizer can take the 7th asset and make it the dominant player because they have the development expertise, the financing, the distribution, the brand, everything. But I think that it's an interesting time, because in the 30 years I've been involved in this, never has there been as much experimentation in the interface between pharma and biotech, and I think that's a very good thing. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.